Yeah, thank you for a really nice introduction. So I'm very excited to be here and to present our work. And I should stress that this is work done by about 50 plus contributors at the Data Provenance Initiative, which is a brand new, as Volker said, collective of researchers from around the world, 15 countries. We have some people from Germany as well. And they are really quite passionate about understanding the data that goes into training AI specifically. And so I have some of the lead authors here, as well as some of our advisors, and they come. Our contributors, I'll stress again, they come from first year undergrads university all the way to advising faculty. We have directors at startups. We have independent researchers, and we have people from nonprofits and civil society. So we do really have a range of different types of contributors bringing their expertise. And one thing in particular that's been important for this project is having some legal advice, as a lot of the things that we're assessing have to do with the preferences and consent around taking and using data from the web. And so it's really special if there are economists or lawyers here. I'd be really curious to hear your perspective, as I think this touches a little bit on the market and supply chain for data in ways that have legal and economic implications. So I'll dive right in. This paper was recently released and is under review at a journal, but the core premise of this work is an audit of the web domains, i.e. websites, that underlie the AI data in massive pre-training corpora that are used to train foundation models, or what we like to call general purpose AI models. And so we specifically look at text data sets that are derived from Common Crawl, which if you haven't heard of Common Crawl, it is sort of the key source. It's a nonprofit that crawls crawls the web and records as an archive different web sources. And this is used for many different applications. So for instance, tens of thousands of academic articles have been enabled by Common Crawl because it's a historical record of the web. So from anthropology, sociology, computer science, AI, and others, people rely on one of these, very unique sources to be able to study all of the human interaction that is conducted on the web. But from Common Crawl, one application of this is the academic and nonprofit and corporate communities that rely on it to develop data sets like C4, DOLMA, and Refined Web, which have themselves together trained millions of different machine learning models, including GPT-3, I would add. And so these data sets are specifically text data sets derived from Common Crawl that have been filtered for quality and sensitive and toxic topics, such that they are a subset that is of high quality and ready for machine learning, to train machine learning models. So what we did is we chose for each of these three large pre-training corpora to sample the head, the top of the distribution, the top 2,000 websites. And so what these are ranked by the size of the websites, i.e. how many tokens or words they contain, and therefore how important they are for the machine learning model. So we take the top 2,000. These are websites you probably would have heard of. They have lots of content. They're like, YouTube, or other, or sorry, I should say like New York Times in some cases for the older sets, other news articles. I believe YouTube's up there as well, other social media platforms, large academic platforms that have collected even user data. And the top 2,000 domains represent, just so you have a sense of scale, about 12% of all of the tokens in C4, 24% of all of the tokens in DOLMA, and 17% of all of the tokens in Refined Web. So this is a substantial chunk, but it's not 90 or 80%, but it's still, I would say, the highest quality and most representative chunk of the core parts of these data sets. We also randomly sample from the intersection of these three, the websites that are contained within these three data sets, about 10,000, to get a general idea of the distribution of websites contained in these, not just the top, but the random set. And then we use this tool called the Wayback Machine, which is itself another historical archive that allows you to go and pull lots of different stored data on websites. And it's specifically, the difference between that and Common Crawl is it actually is a little bit more assertive with what it crawls, and so there's more coverage. And we use that specifically to collect the only web page that you actually have full permission on any website to collect, which is its robots.txt. And that is the singular page that tells you what you are and aren't allowed, according to the website, to crawl and how you should do it on their website. And so you can go to just about any website right now. You could go, for example, or especially the large ones, so to nytimes.com/robots.txt, and you will find this very simple text file that's machine readable. Maybe I should go actually to provide an example. Here we go, newyorktimes.com/robots.txt. You can go to many websites. You can see they have some comments here about the purpose of this. They say, here's a user agent. This one's star. So this is, all user agents have to abide by certain places that are disallowed, certain parts of the website that are allowed. But then if you scroll down, you'll see that for Anthropic AI, ChatGPT user, and various AI companies, this means they disallow everything. So it overrides the instructions for everyone else. It says, nope, if you're one of these, we disallow you access to any part of our website. You better not look at it. And then they have other information to help crawling and improve information, but they have different rules basically for different crawlers. Oh, sorry. Not to drag this a little bit to get back to where I was. And so we use the Wayback Machine to look at the historical permissions or preferences that websites have put up in their robots.txt all the way back to 2016 until April of 2024, when this study was approximately released. And we also look at the terms of service historically of websites, because many of them have terms in natural language that tell you in a legal tone what you can and cannot do with their content. And so we use the robots in terms of service to map out different shades of restrictions. And for terms of service, there's many dimensions to this. There's some that just don't have a terms of service, in which case there don't seem to be any sort of, explicit legal instructions. Some explicitly say much of the website is open access and free to use. And they have, licenses that are compatible with that, like Wikipedia, that has a CC BY license. Others have provisions such as you can't use this content commercially, so it's non-commercial, or you cannot use this content to compete with the services, i.e. if you're a news website, don't take our data to provide news. You can maybe use it for educational purposes or other such things, but not to compete with us. And then this bullet point here is quite interesting. It's the first of its, the first time we've seen this, I'll show you later in a graph, to a large extent, where people are saying specifically in their terms of service, do not use our content for generative AI. That's spiked incredibly in the last year. And then there are parts that say specifically no crawling without our permission, or no crawling and no AI without our permission. And these are sort of emerging categories of increasing relevance and importance. But we also look at other factors around these websites, and that includes how monetized they are. So whether they have paywalls or advertisements. Also, this goes beyond text, because websites are also crawled for images, speech, videos, other content that can empower the next generation of multimodal AI foundation models. So we look at the presence or absence of those across the different spectrum of websites. We also look at the purpose and service of the website. I'll explain this more later, but as we sort of alluded to, At least in the US, the debate around fair use of data, whether or not you're allowed to use it, whether you have permission or not from a website, revolves around how you use that data and whether or not that data is used for a new purpose than what it was originally created for. And so again, if the purpose of the website is news, it's probably infringement if you take their data or their expression to serve their news. But if you serve it for other purposes, that might be fair use. And so it's important to record what these purposes are. And the lawsuits that are out there are actively debating whether or not generative AI is fair use with respect to many of the different websites that are out there. The last categories we look at are the extent that user content is on a web page. So why is this important? The New York Times or a news website, they have pretty curated content that their editors and they themselves, the company, have put out. But something like YouTube or Reddit or Stack Overflow is largely a database of user-generated content. And that content, in this case, the website itself isn't the copyright holder of this content. There's a lot of really rich, even storytelling that happens on Reddit where they will post, or YouTube, where you post your new novel expression content and where you have your own followers or such. And in this case, although you might sign away the terms, Reddit or YouTube, they aren't the copyright holder, they aren't the creator of the data. But it's also true in user-generated content that content can be put up from, people can post videos or images that aren't their own and that come from copyrighted and published sources, or they post movies that maybe aren't their own. So this is the most opportunity when you have websites like this for complexity around how data rights and preferences can and should be governed. The last thing we collect is sensitive content. So we asked our annotators to flag when or if they saw content that contained highly erotic or sexual or violent or illegal, like selling illegal drugs or such things on a website. And I'll note that a lot of this has to be collected manually. We tried to automate some of it, but we needed to make sure, especially for an audit, that we were doing things precisely and were able to have a reflective analysis of reality. And so we needed to often have humans in the loop. And I'll stress that we had humans from a crowd working platform that we interacted with. Whereas in many AI and other annotation companies, they're not paid very well. It's been in the news. All of our annotators were paid, regardless of where they were, above $25 an hour, and carefully communicated with and negotiated with in advance. And this is including in places where that's, I think, like more than 1,000% of the average wages. So we worked hard to make sure that our annotators were treated well. And so I think it's time to dive into the results. So, one more graph. These are the different types of attributes which we collected manually. And then others we were able to collect with a robot, especially terms and restrictions. We were able we had to collect these with specialized prompts on ChatGPT or GPT-4o. Whether or not a license, which is a pretty simple document, they're very templatized, whether or not it had a clause, restricting AI. We tested the efficacy of these different prompts, and they were all very, very high. And so we're comfortable to say with little margin of error that the results we report are accurate. And then the watch here means that we collect these over time from 2016 onwards. So I can come back to this, but to show sort of the main graph, we look at the robots.txt, like the one I showed you earlier, and how restrictions or presence of robots.txt has changed over time. And so we have in dark red whether full restrictions exist on basically a set of different AI organizations, mainly corporate, on whether there are pattern-based restrictions over what they can access, different private directories that are disallowed, other restrictions, And as it goes from red to blue, or then finally gray, more permissiveness around what's enabled. So crawl delay just means the website's asking that the crawler adds a delay to some of its activity so it doesn't overwhelm the website, but there aren't really prohibitions on where it can go. Sitemap means it's actually adding things to help crawling. No restrictions in sitemap is even more permissive. And then no robots means that there are no expressed preferences, although that does not mean that there is necessarily consent provided because the website didn't have the resources to provide its signal in a robots.txt. Now, I'll mention this again, but I'll quickly say a robots.txt or express preferences that, at least in the US, do not have any legal enforcement. If someone crawls your data and ignores your robots, they are not legally, they do not appear to be legally liable. I'm not a lawyer, but this is what I am told. And sometimes there's good reason for this. So there are sort of crawler wars that are underway between the public parts of X and Meta and different nonprofits and research institutes that have said we don't want to pay, for instance, the heads of X tens of thousands of dollars to get pretty minimal access to understand what's going on, and like pretty much a digital public square where they want to study how content moderation is happening, the spread or absence of misinformation, and other sort of important pro-social research or journalism. And so this is sort of a open debate. But currently, the robots.txt is something that large search engines respect because they want to have a good relationship with the websites, not because they have to, but because they'd like to. And also AI companies, they document, for the most part, the major ones, that they do respect the robots.txt, maybe not historically, but they do when they visit a new website. But they have also recently in the news been accused of not doing so in some cases. And so there's open debate there, and it's difficult to detect the extent to which they are. So anyway, that's a lot of the background. I'm happy to talk more about it, but the actual results here is that over time, we're seeing a mass adoption, not just of the robots.txt across the top, these are the top 2,000 web domains from the C4 dataset, but we're seeing most notably a huge spike in this red area here in the full restrictions being applied to AI organizations. And this seems pretty unprecedented and dramatic that just since late to mid 2023, so less than 1 year really, we see a very rapid increase in the amount of websites that fully restrict the amount of data, all of their data for these websites, for the AI developers. And this is non-trivial. The reason why it's non-trivial is because AI companies and developers, one of their main moats or elements of competition is the scale of data. Scaling laws is a new area of study in AI that basically tries to predict how much data you need to get a certain performance or how much compute you need. And so much of the new capabilities that we have seen in new AI products, general purpose AI, are due to large scale of data, mainly sourced from the web, the data commons. And so we expect that these trends may continue and that they will have an effect, especially on the developers that respect robots.txt or new entrants that can't afford to license all of this data and buy it themselves or have already collected it before much of this was locked down or the drawbridge was pulled up. So the next plot shows company by company how this works, because as you saw in the beginning, there are different crawlers associated with different companies. OpenAI actually has 2 crawlers. Anthropic has 1 crawler that they document, but then there's a bunch of sort of, I'm going to say, false crawlers for Anthropic. It's unclear where they came from or whether Anthropic is responsible at all for them. I emailed them. Anthropic said they are unaware of those. They're not official and they can't speak for the whole company, but they're not aware of these crawlers. which just goes to show the complexity, because every website has to figure out what the name is of the specific crawler they want to call out, what that's used for, how they should restrict it. And that's really difficult when there are now hundreds of different AI crawlers and organizations and companies. It's a full-time job probably just figuring out what to restrict and what not to. And that burden falls almost entirely on the websites to do so. And so they become much more conservative and probably would rather restrict everything and then just enable, the few search engines they want to access them, and try to just restrict everything rather than try to keep track of all these different AI crawlers. But they do their best, and as a result of missing many crawlers, they end up getting the most notable ones, OpenAI, a much higher percentage of the time. We actually reran this analysis with a little bit finer granularity. These numbers went up, and this is closer to 25%. So for 25% of all the tokens, OpenAI is restricted. Anthropic's about 10%, followed by Common Crawl. This is the Google AI bot. Then the false Anthropic bots, the Internet Archive, and then Meta and Cohere, which are also very notable AI developers, sort of fly under the radar because people don't realize that they're also developing, or many of the creators out there aren't as in the loop to know that they're also developing AI bots. And so there's these sort of weird asymmetries, these weird contradictions we see where people are blocking this bot, but not this bots. They think that they're blocking a certain company, but they're not. And this leads to a very messy situation that just means people aren't able to communicate their preferences as they likely want to be able to. But it's also important to recognize the large asymmetries that this results in between the different companies and crawlers, and what this might mean. And so this is sort of another way of showing this. It's basically if any of the crawlers, or sorry, I'm trying to remember what this means. Basically, this is a way of formulating if any crawler is blocked, what's the percentage that this crawler is blocked? I believe that's how we formulated it. And so you just sort of get a ranking whereby OpenAI is if any of these are blocked, OpenAI is probably included 91% of the time, followed by many of these others in this order. And then the gray ones are non-AI commercial developers. So Common Crawl is a nonprofit. Their crawler and the websites and data that they use is used for a wide variety of things well beyond AI and commercial AI. And in the case of the Internet Archive, also it's a web archive, and Google Search is the bot for web search, which websites like, because they like traffic, rather than Google's AI crawler. And so you see a real lack of standardization here in the sort of disparate coverage and understanding. And so for the last large-scale temporal plot that I'll show you, we're going to talk a little bit about the web domain's terms of service. And so this is another natural language way of communicating how the preferences you have over your data, but not in which individual crawler has access to what, or what it has access to or not, but how you in natural language in general want your data to be used or not want it to be used. And so this is more of a natural way that has been adopted to express things. But the tragedy is that while in terms of service is so much more expressive than robots.txt, it isn't used because it's not very machine readable. We actually use machines in the study to read it using our bots and prompts, but there's a margin of error. It's hard to always know exactly what a license means because, if you get it wrong, it's, quite specific legal language. So we categorized it pretty, coarsely into like pretty conventional buckets, but there could be other things that are harder to like interpret that aren't standardized in a machine readable way. But what we do see here is sort of a spike for the first time in crawlers that are saying no to AI, to terms of service, they're saying no to AI specifically. And we're seeing a large portion of websites really starting to use terms of service as sort of a potential legal backstop to say, we've expressed that we have all these prohibitions, especially against no crawling or no AI or no commercial use. So, why are you crawling us if you are doing so? But there are other preferences as well, as I stressed earlier, from non-compete to no redistribution, conditional use, as well as some people saying unrestricted use. And so we are seeing a shift towards more restrictive, no crawling, no AI, and expect this trend to increase. And I would note that all of these here, these red ones, would restrict AI, corporate AI in some way. And this is a much larger proportion of data than this, the red areas here. Like this one, still you can crawl some parts of the website. And so the terms of service, there's a huge discrepancy between what people want there versus what people have communicated in the robots.txt, partly because that probably requires a little bit of expertise. So altogether, we're seeing systematic trends declining the availability of important AI data, especially if you respect their terms or robots.txt. And we're seeing asymmetrical restrictions across agents and companies in ways that are complicated in how they might play out. The more these restrictions proliferate, there will be questions as to whether AI companies will abide by these restrictions. And if they don't abide by them, there is potential, and we're already seeing this, for AI companies to leverage, creators and websites to leverage anti-circumvention technologies that make it technologically harder to crawl. But the thing is, this is going to affect less AI companies and more academics, journalists, researchers who don't have complex crawling infrastructure that they can afford to build or to license. And so we're going to see a discrepancy here about who's paying the price for the crawler wars that may ensue. We might even see creators opt to not put their data online at all, or to use data poisoning, or to invest in more of these anti-crawling technologies that make it harder to access their data. So I touched on this a little bit, and I'll maybe save a bit of this for questions, but there are sort of weird discrepancies between what's expressed in the robots.txt, whether they're fully restricted, no restrictions, partial restrictions, and the various different types of more naturally defined prohibitions or restrictions in the terms of service. And basically, many of these kind of conflict or are not congruent, meaning that we have issues in the current status quo, the robots.txt, and what it is able to represent. And maybe it's just not suited for the age of AI and the more complex needs that creators have in expressing their data preferences. Let me take a quick drink. So this table is simpler than it looks. I'll explain really quickly. On this left-hand side, we talk about different variables with respect to websites. So whether or not their robots are restrictive, their terms are restrictive, whether or not they have user content, paywalls, ads, whether or not they have images, videos, or independent speech or audio clips, sensitive content. And then this here is sort of the composition of the website or the purpose of it. So like, is it really for hosting academic information? Like, is it a journal website? Is it a personal blog? Is it an e-commerce website? Is it an encyclopedia or database? Is it a government website? This is the news or periodical, business type of website. And then we have social media and forums, and then organizational and personal websites, and then a small category of like everything else. So this talks about the percentage of which in the top 100 URLs averaged across the three corpora we looked at. So 54.6% of the top 100 domains have automatic ads. This is higher for the top 500, and then a little bit lower again for the top 2,000. And then we compare this to the random sample of websites that's kind of like the rest of the web. And I'll note the web has a really long tail. There's almost no overlap in our random sample between that and the top 2000 because of how many websites there are. And so this is kind of like everything else. And we show the difference between the top 2000 and the random using colors and these percentages here. And so you can see there's a 35% increase in how restrictive terms are for the top 2000 websites as compared to the random websites. And then this just shows percentage by corpora, but we'll focus on these columns here. So the first important thing to notice is that so the top websites are dramatically comprised of news and periodical type websites. 45% more so among these, the 50% of them than among the random websites, of which only 5% can be classified as some sort of periodical. So the head of the web, most of the important websites that are highest quality, well curated, and the largest ones that are really relied on and likely to be licensed and that are more restrictive are news periodicals, social media and forums, encyclopedias, and academic websites. But the rest of the web that increasingly are going to be more prevalent in these data sets because they're less restricted are organizations or personal websites, blogs, and maybe to some extent, e-commerce websites. And so you can see that as restrictions proliferate, the type of websites that are used to develop AI models are shifting, as well as the type of content. And that means that the availability of images, videos, and audio, which are much more prevalent on the top websites than the random websites, there's going to be less availability of those. And we also see that the top websites are much more commercialized with paywalls and ads. And so there are clear feature differences that are really important to just understanding the composition of the web that goes into AI and how this may or may not matter as that composition is forced to shift with new restrictions. Okay, we're on to the last result before we hand over to questions. This is potentially the most controversial result of the paper. So I'm going to start by saying there are many limitations to this. What we do is we look at the most widely, there's a new data set, which is the most available data set that we have for real ChatGPT logs. Real is in quotes. So real means here, it's called wild chat. It means that someone hosted an instance of ChatGPT, posted it to a platform called Hugging Face, and then left it open for the public or volunteers to go give consent for their logs to be published, and then go and use ChatGPT on this platform. And they collected millions of interactions from, I think, tens of thousands of different individuals. And so this is the best thing that we have that represents naturalistic data and how people are really using at least ChatGPT, at least in a very specified time frame, and at least in the context of knowing their data was being collected. And so it's unclear how representative this is of reality, but it's the best that we have. And so I read personally hundreds of these different logs to understand what's in them and how we should categorize them. And the reason we did this is because it's interesting and important to see how real uses of ChatGPT may or may not be congruent or incongruent with the purposes of the websites. That has an impact potentially on the fair use debate over copyright, if you're using it for the same reason or a different reason. And it also has implications for how shifts in what data is trained on might shift the model's ability to do the things that people are increasingly relying on it to do. And so on the left, you see the percentage of different data set, different sort of services we talked about in the last plot. News is very popular. Source of data, followed by encyclopedias, social media org sites. Many of the news are, these ones show ads or paywalls. And on the right, we see the different, imperfect categorizations that we created for how people are using wild chat. And we found that the number one by far at almost 30% was creative composition. People would ask it to write poems and little stories and do role play and do fun different things that are creative or fictional, and or expressive in different ways. The number 2 point, which we talked about in our paper, and we can talk about more, is that it was actual, I'd say sexual role play or romantic, sort of pseudo-erotic role play, maybe, in a fantastical sense. We also saw brainstorming and planning, explanation and reasoning, general information requests, coding, a variety of different things. The one at the bottom that's controversial is that when the information is explicitly asking for some sort of current affairs or news update, it was a very small percentage of the time, indicating there's a mismatch between the amount of data used here and what it's used for. But it's hard to say whether that means that the news industry won't be as impacted by generative AI, because people don't replace news with generative AI. I think that's a good thing. It's unclear whether what that means for a copyright case that the news industries are having against different AI developers. And it's also a little bit unclear whether or not this news data is important in other types of questions here that it's hard to necessarily represent directly. So I more put this here as sort of a call for new analysis and understanding of how ChatGPT and these services are really being used, because I think that's very important in understanding many questions around user or data creator consent, their preferences, and the market for data and how that could evolve. So I want to thank everybody for listening to our long set of a very long audit, and we'll note that there are a few really beautifully written articles that have been put out there on the New York Times, 404 Media, and Vox that really sort of encapsulate some of the core findings and put it in a nice way if you're looking to read more. And of course, we have our paper and we have our website, and we're coming out with more data audits in the future, particularly in the multimodal domain. Thank you so much for listening, and really happy to answer any questions.